Welcome to part 2 of the lecture. In this part, we will continue investigating second language learning and teaching in the classroom setting. Second language acquisition research has been informed by observation of the second language learning and teaching process that takes place in classroom settings. To study classroom second language learning and teaching, the different types of interaction that happen inside the classroom, such as teacher and student interaction and student interaction, are often observed following an observation scheme or an ethnographic approach. In terms of classroom observation schemes, in this lecture, we will focus on two features of classroom interaction which have been commonly examined, namely corrective feedback and question types. Then after that, we'll explore ethnography as a method for observing second language classroom learning and teaching. Before going into discussing classroom observation, you might be wondering, why do we need to observe the classroom? Well, there are multiple reasons to do so. We observe the classroom to understand what teachers do, how students learn, how teaching practices might impact on student learning, and based on these observations, we can help to train the trainee teachers, and we can also provide suggestions for teacher professional development in terms of their teaching methodology. So as you can see, that the purpose of observing classroom activities is to improve language teaching and enhance language learning. So how do we observe classrooms? What are some of the ways of observing classrooms? There are typically two main ways: using an observation scheme and ethnography. First, let's talk about observation schemes. What is an observation scheme? It is a method of observing classrooms using a set of predetermined categories to record teacher and students' activities in the classroom. Observation schemes are often developed before the data collection is conducted. These schemes are then used in the classroom at real time or afterward using audio or video recordings of the classroom. The purpose of observation schemes is also to analyze what is happening in the classroom. So, what does an observation scheme look like? Because of differences in purposes, observation schemes can be designed differently. An example of an observation scheme used in a second language classroom context is the COLT, or Communicative Orientation of Language Teaching, which was developed by Nina Spada, one of the authors of our textbook, and her colleagues. The purpose of the COLT is to analyze the communicative features of verbal exchanges between students and teachers within language classroom activities. The COLT is divided into two parts. On the screen, we're looking at part A, which describes teaching practices in terms of content, focus, and organization of activity types. So you can see that these focuses of the COLT can tell us about the degree of communicativeness that might be demonstrated in a language classroom activity. So when using part A, observers can record whether the activities are learner-centered, whether the focus is on language form or meaning, and whether students work in pairs, in groups, or individually to complete an activity. The COLT and other similar schemes have been used in classroom research to record teaching practices and to help determine how differences in teaching practices are related to differences in language learning. Observation scheme can be very specific to the researcher's needs, but the scheme can also be very broad or very narrow, depending on what the researcher wants to know about a certain classroom practice. Now let's move to examine two specific features of classroom interaction, which were initially inspired by classroom observation research, including teachers' corrective feedback and the kind of questions that they ask in the classroom. So let's talk about teachers' corrective feedback first. What is teachers' corrective feedback? Teachers' feedback is a response to learners' utterances that contains or is perceived to contain errors. A related concept when discussing corrective feedback is the notion of uptake, which is described as an indication that the learner has noticed the feedback given to them. To illustrate, I would like you to take some time to read the funny cartoon on the slide. Alright, as we can see in the cartoon, Rita does not seem to notice the intended feedback that Mary provides her because she gives a genuine response to what Mary says instead of correcting her previous utterance. In this case, we can say that there seems to be no uptake of the corrective feedback. Teachers' corrective feedback is an important feature of classroom second language teaching. One of the seminal studies which adopted classroom observation to describe teachers' corrective feedback is Lister and Ranta, 1997. The researchers describe different types of feedback that teachers give on errors in an observation scheme they developed for language immersion learners. The categories used in their observation scheme have also been used to describe second language instruction in other contexts. As shown on the slide, there are different types of feedback that teachers might give students in a classroom context, such as recast, explicit correction, clarification requests, metalinguistic feedback, elicitation, and repetition. Now let's explore each of these corrective feedback types in more detail. The first one is recast. It is when the teacher reformulates either partially or completely the learner's errors. The example in the slide shows that one student says there are 3 mouses in the picture, and the teacher recasts the learner's utterance in the correct way by saying there are 3 mice. So this is an example of teacher's feedback in the form of recast. Explicit correction is when the teacher provides correct form and explicit indication of an error. For example, a student might look at a wolf and says it's a dog. The teacher, in order to correct the student explicitly, would say, you said dog, and that's not right, it's a wolf. Clarification requests is when the teacher indicates to learners that their utterance needs some kind of reformulation. This can be done by asking for clarification, such as, pardon, what? What do you mean? As shown in the example on the slide. Metalinguistic feedback is when the teacher's feedback includes comments using grammatical terminology on the correctness of the learner's utterance, such as when the learner says, I lost all my book. The teacher might use metalinguistic feedback by saying, you have to say books if you lost more than one. The plural s means that there was more than one, so 1 book, 2 books, many books. Elicitation is when the teacher tries to elicit the target form from learners. This can be done by the teacher eliciting completion of their own utterance, such as, I have more than 1 dog, so that means I have many, and then the teacher would expect the learner to complete their sentence. Or the teachers can use questions to elicit correct forms, such as, how do we say X in English? Repetition is a kind of feedback when the teacher repeats the learner's incorrect utterance using intonation or emphasis to highlight the error, as shown in the example in the slide. So as you can see, these types of feedback vary in relation to whether the feedback is implicit or explicit, which means whether the feedback directly or indirectly tells the learner what their error is. In that sense, recasts are an implicit kind of feedback, and metalinguistic comments are an explicit kind of feedback. Lister's and Ranter's observation of the French immersion classes indicated that recasts were the preferred type of feedback in the observed classroom. However, elicitations and metalinguistic feedback appeared to result in more uptake. Based on this seminal classroom observation study of feedback, a big volume of research has investigated feedback types and their role in second language acquisition. More recently, feedback has also been classified into two broad types, apart from explicit and implicit. These types are input providing and output prompting feedback. Input providing feedback provides positive evidence which contains linguistic information about what is acceptable in the target language. Meanwhile, output prompting feedback does not supply learners with a target-like form or positive evidence, but it creates opportunities for learners to self-correct or to modify their output by indicating to learners that there are comprehension or language issues in their utterances. So based on the recent categorization of feedback, I'd like you to pause the video for a minute to do a quick exercise. In your opinion, which of the following feedback types is input providing and which of them is output prompting? I hope that you'll be able to classify them, but don't worry if you're still not very sure, because we'll go back to analyze these feedback types in class next week. Since corrective feedback is a well-researched area in second language acquisition, let's look at what has been found about the role of corrective feedback in language learning. The major finding of corrective feedback research is that corrective feedback contributes to the development of second language learning. At the same time, there have been mixed findings about which type of feedback is more effective than others. However, what can be concluded from research at this point is that feedback is better than no feedback. Now let's move to the second feature of classroom observation, which is teachers' questions. When studying classroom interaction, a large amount of research has been directed towards teachers' questioning behavior because questions are often a key element in engaging students in interaction and to check whether they understand what's being taught. Regarding teachers' questions, a distinction has been made between display questions and genuine questions. Display questions are those to which the teacher already knows the answer, and genuine questions are those to which the teacher may not know the answer. An example of a display question is when the teacher asks students questions so that they can display their knowledge of the language, such as what is the past tense form of go? This kind of question is often used in a structure-based classroom setting where the focus is on learning language structures. An example of a genuine question is when the teacher gives students a meaningful language task to do and asks questions about the learners that she might not know. This kind of question is often used in a communicative classroom setting where the focus is on using the language to convey meaning. An example of such questions could be, tell me about your brother, how old is he? The role of teachers' questions in classroom interaction has been examined in several studies, as you can see on the slide. Results of these studies have indicated that both display and genuine questions may serve important interaction and pedagogic purposes depending on the way they are used in the classroom. So up to this point, I have introduced what observation schemes are and two specific features of classroom that are investigated through observation schemes, which are corrective feedback and teachers' questions. Now I will move to the second approach of doing classroom observation, which is ethnography. What is ethnography? Ethnography is a method of describing and observing the classroom without using any predetermined categories. That is, we observe the classroom using extensive notes on activities, practices, and interactions between the teacher and the learners. When we start doing so, we do not have any predetermined criteria in mind, which means we do not decide on what should be observed and what should not be observed. We simply immerse ourselves in the classroom environment and observe what's going on. Given this way of data collection, the research product resulting from an ethnographic approach will often be qualitative. That is, what researchers produce out of this ethnographic approach is descriptions or narratives about teaching and learning, as well as other factors such as political, social, and cultural features of the classroom. So to summarize, in the second part of the lecture, I have introduced approaches to observing second language classrooms. I also examined features of classroom interaction that have been observed and studied in relation to second language learning and teaching, namely corrective feedback and questions in the classroom. Additionally, I presented ethnography as a research methodology used to describe interaction in the second language classroom, among other settings. The difference between the ethnographic approach to studying classroom context is the lack of predetermined categories of analysis, unlike what we see in observation schemes, in which there are specific criteria or categories that observers can use when observing the classroom. I hope that through this lecture, you have gained a better understanding of the importance of observing classroom settings, as well as the different methods of observing second language classrooms. Before ending this week's lecture, we have some reflection questions for you to think about in relation to second language classroom observation. We'll discuss some of the issues that are raised in these questions in the tutorial activities. So have a think about them. So this is the end of the lecture. Thank you for your listening and see you in class.